Welcome to the Amphibian Press podcast. I'm V.S. Holmes, and with me today is Robert J. Sawyer. He's a Hugo and Nebula winner, and I'm going to read the blurb for his newest book, The Oppenheimer Alternative. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer famously exclaimed when the first atomic bomb exploded in 1945. His Manhattan Project gathered the greatest scientists ever assembled, including Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, Leo Szilard, and Enrico Fermi. In this meticulously researched novel, Oppenheimer keeps those geniuses together after the war, joined by Albert Einstein, computing pioneer John von Neumann, and rocket designer Werner von Braun, in hopes of saving our planet from an environmental catastrophe. If they succeed, they will be able to declare, "Now we are become life, the saviors of the world." So thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, VS. Thank you for having me.
So give me a little bit of the background for your inspiration on this newest book.
Well, I live in Canada, and the Montreal Fringe Festival was doing a one-man show. And I love one-man, one-woman shows. I think it's an
Yes.
incredible art form when an actor can get on stage and enthrall you for an hour with a continuous monologue. And there was one about the life of Leo Szilard, who was one of the Manhattan Project scientists. It was by a British playwright. He was touring fringe festivals all over the world. His name is Jem Rolls, Rolls, and his play was called, great title, The Inventor of All Things, because Leo Szilard invented a refrigeration system. He shared the patent on that with Albert Einstein, of all people. He was also, among his inventions or discoveries, was the notion of nuclear fission chain reaction. And he actually offered the patent on that to the British government, saying, I don't want this falling into private hands, and I certainly don't want it falling into enemy hands. And they ignored him. So he's the guy who urged Einstein to write a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying, look, somebody else is going to stumble on this, and it's going to make possible incredibly powerful bombs. If somebody's going to have it, it better be us. He was a guy who had escaped Europe, escaped persecution, and become a European Jew who had come to the United States to avoid Hitler and get the atomic bomb project going. And that play was the inspiration for me.
Awesome. I always am fascinated by what little sparks get our minds churning and get us asking questions that we might not have asked before.
Well, that's exactly right. It was a friend of mine who said, look, Rob, you got to see this play. This is right up your street, because my street as a writer, it's my 24th novel, The Oppenheimer Alternative, and my street is writing about the moral responsibility scientists have for their work, their inventions, the societal repercussions. And there's never been a bigger case in history of that being an issue than the case of the development of the atomic bomb. So, of course, it immediately resonated with me. And from Szilard, who is a fascinating character, but not as famous. Very few people outside, really, of history buffs have heard of him. But his relationship with the other characters, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, that everybody had heard of, that's what propelled me into researching Oppenheimer. Yeah. And there I discovered this larger-than-life, incredibly complex, incredibly conflicted character who was well worth a whole novel on his own, and hence the Oppenheimer Alternative was born.
Well, so my background's in science. I took bio, and that's one of the things that I really found fascinating was not just the science, which was interesting in and of itself, but these incredible minds. And you'll hear the people's names who are on discoveries, but there are so many things going on behind the scenes that we really aren't aware of until we dive deeper. And I think that not just morally, but also just understanding the politics behind so many of these discoveries is really fascinating.
Well, you're exactly right, VS. And this was one of the huge sources of tension amongst the Manhattan Project scientists, because before the war and right up until the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, J. Robert Oppenheimer was adamant. Scientists have no special insight into political matters or human affairs, and our opinions should be given no special weight. Leo Szilard, on the other hand, said, "Hey, what are you talking about? We're the brightest people on the planet. If we don't have valuable insights into political matters and human affairs, who the heck on this ball of dirt does?" So there was an enormous amount of back and forth, and Oppenheimer ultimately flipped and came to realize once the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, oh my God, we've started something that wasn't a one off, that it's now been done twice in 72 hours. Who knows how many times it's going to be done in the future? And Oppenheimer devoted the rest of his life to politics, to arms control, to trying to get the nuclear genie that he had unleashed, and you can't do it, it's Pandora's box,
Right.
stuffed back into the bottle.
Yeah, that's just incredible. So when you were writing these real historical figures, because I know a lot of times with fiction, it is purely fiction. A lot of us have those little disclaimers in the fronts of our books saying like, oh, it's just a coincidence. This isn't a real person. What were your challenges writing these real people?
It's funny you mentioned that disclaimer because I couldn't run it. Every character in the book is a real person. One of the publishers who was considering the book, we ultimately took a different offer, although they were prepared to offer, actually had their legal department review the entire manuscript because although you technically cannot libel the dead, you still got to be careful, right, about what you're doing.
Right.
And everybody except one character in the book, two at the time I wrote it, one sadly passed away since I finished the book. That was the great physicist Freeman Dyson, who died
Mm,
earlier this year at the age of 96. But yeah, these are real people, and they're, as I say, all dead now with one exception. And the one exception is the child, is Peter Oppenheimer, Oppie's son. These people lived in living memory. Their children and grandchildren are still alive. They're grad students in many cases. One of the people who very kindly reviewed my book in manuscript for me was Gregory Benford, a very fine science fiction writer in his own right, but also a professor of physics, University of
mhm.
California, Irvine, who was Edward Teller's graduate student. So he
Oh,
knew
cool.
Teller intimately, who was one of the characters that I was writing about. And to go to the people who knew these people personally, you can find their achievements. Look them up in Encyclopedia Britannica. There's a list of every award they won and major paper they published, but that doesn't tell you anything about the man or the woman. That
Right.
requires a lot of research.
I've never really delved into real historic figures with my own work, partially because I have to research enough of the science. I just don't. It's not that I don't trust myself, but it's such an undertaking to write about real people and really do them justice, but also be honest because, like anyone, they're human, and while you don't want to portray them necessarily poorly, I suppose depending on the person, you also don't want to glorify things.
That's right. This year, 2020, is the 75th anniversary of the birth of the atomic age.
Hmm.
1945, the Trinity test, the first bomb, the bombing of Hiroshima, the bombing of Nagasaki. Enough time has passed that we have a certain amount of objectivity. You cannot start a conversation in the United States about Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or Barack Obama without it polarizing immediately and tempers flaring because
Right.
it's too close. It's too soon. There's no historical objectivity. Whereas if you bring up Taft or McKinley or
Hmm.
some past president of the United States, everybody says, "Oh, I vaguely remember that guy. Okay, tell me what you know about him." So we have a objectivity at this point. But you're right. One of my favorite movies is Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to
Oh
Stop
yes.
Worrying and Love the Bomb is the subtitle. And generally accepted, there are many candidates, but generally accepted as the principal model for Dr. Strangelove is, in fact, Dr. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. Well, he comes off as, of course, a Nazi sympathizer in the movie, and most accounts of his life, and he lived the longest of almost all the Manhattan Project scientists. He lived to a ripe old age, unlike Oppie, who died at 62. Most of the
Mhm.
accounts of his life paint him as a villain. And he had a lot of what I would consider personally villainous or evil thoughts. But nobody, as you well know as a fellow writer, VS, nobody is the villain
Mhm.
in their own mind. Darth Vader doesn't
No.
think, today I am going to be villainous. He thinks he's saving the empire, right? Which is what,
Mhm.
Donald Trump thinks he's doing right now, Nobody
Exactly.
stops and thinks that they're the bad guys. So we talk about scientists, and you see it, there's this notion in science fiction that will preserve their brains in a jar for
Mhm.
future generations. Einstein's is in a jar in a museum, as a matter of fact. And that's the tiniest portion of a man. It's 3 to 5 pounds, five if you're lucky, of
Right.
150 to 200 pounds. It's the tiniest fraction. A man is driven, and a woman, by his or her hormones, his or her sex drive, his or her oxytocin, his or her oxycontin, his or her whatever drugs they take, whatever drugs are
Mhm.
already in their system, whether they're drinking a lot of caffeine and they're feeling sharp, whether they've just woken up. It's not a brain in a jar. These are human beings who respond to
Mhm.
all the other human beings around them, sometimes in very petty ways.
That's so true. Now, sort of speaking about some of these political things and challenges with writing sci-fi, you've obviously been a part of the science fiction genre for a while, and I always feel like sci-fi at its core is a little bit what we want to see in the world as authors and as creators. First of all, do you agree? And what are you painting that you want to see more in the world?
So personally, I agree. I'm not sure the field as a whole agrees, because there's an awful
That's fair.
lot of what's called cautionary tales, a great history of that in science fiction. 1984, as people have said since Donald Trump became president, dude, it wasn't supposed to be an instruction manual, right? It was a cautionary tale. You mentioned your background, VS, is in biological sciences. Well, Brave New World was the original bioscience, genetic engineering
Yes.
novel. And it, again, was intended as a cautionary tale. Margaret Atwood, who will tell you that every incident that she magnified and expanded upon in The Handmaid's Tale was rooted in a real life injustice against women somewhere in our
Hmm.
contemporary world. She may have what you do in science fiction. You bring in the big lens and you magnify something that otherwise is going by unnoticed. But neither
Hmm.
Margaret nor Orwell nor Huxley had any intention that their dreams be blueprints for a better tomorrow. But that said, I'm from the Gene Roddenberry Star Trek generation of
Hmm.
science fiction writers. And I firmly believe that unless there are positive visions put on the table, part of the smorgasbord of futures laid out in front of us. Okay, this one stinks. This one is dystopian. This one here is mass overpopulation with people dying of starvation. But this one, that I can get behind and will fight to make a reality. If you don't have that final one, the win-win, the positive scenario, then one or another of the negative ones will become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes. I definitely feel like part of the popularization of sci-fi that we're seeing lately, because it was a bit more niche, I think, earlier on, with some notable exceptions. But I think part of the popularity is as our science gets closer to what we view as sci-fi, even if it's not fiction anymore, we need roadmaps of how to navigate these sort of complicated technological worlds and the morality of them and the politics of them. And I think that's why we're seeing more of it in mainstream and why we're gravitating towards it. But it's hard when you look at this and you're like, well, if this is a roadmap, it's one heck of a bumpy road that we've got here.
People are waking up to the notion that every major moral issue society faces is, in fact, at its root, a technological issue, which is what science fiction talks about. Take the most divisive issue in American politics, the abortion issue. Now,
Mhm.
abortion has existed since the dawn of time, but the fact that you can safely have an abortion without being a threat to the mother's life is a
Mhm.
very recent technological innovation. You look at the Republicans' debating the Democrats in the 1940s or the 1950s, nobody mentions abortion. It wasn't until the 60s and really the 70s when
Mhm.
it moved out of the back alleys and into the hospitals and licensed clinics that it became a profound issue. Now, whether you sit on that issue, you have to recognize at its core, it became front and center because of scientific medical advances. As you and I speak right now, VS, it's the first week of June 2020. And across the globe, people are standing up and saying loudly, Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
Now, we think, is that a technological issue? In this instance, yes, it is, because the spark of this groundswell was the fact that all sorts of people are walking around these days, more are than aren't in the developed world, with cameras in their pockets as part of their cellular telephones.
Mhm.
So that the murder of George Floyd by an unarmed black man by a white police officer was recorded. And it was the recording, the fact that it could be uploaded and shared almost immediately to social media, a technological innovation that supervenes on top of the World Wide Web, which was invented at
Mhm.
CERN, the European Center for Particle Physics, by Tim Berners-Lee. One layer atop another technological advances, and the world has changed. As a
Yes.
friend of mine, Michael Okuda, he's the graphic designer associated with the various Star Trek series, very wisely quipped yesterday. Isn't it odd that as soon as everybody started carrying cameras with them on their phones, that Bigfoot and UFOs disappeared because they'd never been there, but the killing of black men by cops, which have been happening all the time, suddenly is everywhere. The fact is that technology has made reality accessible. And as you know, the great Isaac Asimov, one of my idols in science fiction, he put it so succinctly. Science fiction, it's not fiction about science, it's not fictional science. It is, quote, the responses of human beings to changes in science and technology, end
Mhm.
quote. That's why science fiction is so important right now. It's the literature that puts those inventions that are going to change the world on our agenda for discussion today, so that when they actually hit us in the face, whether it's next week, next month, next year, next decade, we're
Mhm.
not gobsmacked, but are prepared for them.
That's so, so true. Backing up a little bit, speaking of technology and writing and our responses to it, um, from a craft standpoint, you've written for television, you've written for games, and you've obviously written novels. Do you find that your craft changes, your process changes when you are working on these different mediums? And also, what's the response to these things across those different mediums?
You know, the great Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan is best known for his aphorism, the medium is the message.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so true that whatever medium you are writing in completely changes the way you have to craft what you're saying. The only reason in this world of $100 million blockbuster movies and computer generated imagery that can show us anything at all that our minds can imagine on the screen, the only reason the world that books persist and still remain enormously popular is they can do one thing that those media can't. Books, novels, fiction is the art form, the medium of the inner lives of
Mm-hmm.
characters. You write what their stream of consciousness thought is during a scene. What they say is not necessarily what they're thinking, right? Somebody can say, I love you, while thinking, I hate you. And, you don't know unless you're inside their head. So the beauty of writing fiction, prose fiction, is it is the closest thing to telepathy, to the reading of minds that humanity has ever developed. Now, when you write scripts that I've written for the TV series Flash Forward, based on my novel of the same name, I've written 2 commissioned feature film screenplays. I've done other scripts as well. Scripts, it's all the external life. And you're not allowed to direct from the page. You can't say on the page, the actor should now pause, put a hand on her chin, look reflectively out the window, take a deep breath, and then finally say, obviously sarcastically, I love you too. You can't. All you can write is maybe at most a parenthetical, and even those are frowned upon, which goes after the dialogue name. Uh, Jasmine, parenthetical, sarcastically, I love you
Mhm.
too. That's it. That's all you can do. You can't do the rest in prose fiction, which is why it's my chosen art form, right? I'm a member of the Canadian and the American Scriptwriters Unions. If I wanted to be writing scripts full time, I would be doing that. I write novels as my principal form because it is a more satisfying experience in terms of developing and exploring character than any other art form that's available. In fact, I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier in the interview my fondness for one person stage shows. Those
Mhm.
tend to be the exception because it is the monologue, the inner thoughts of a character who will say, as in the one I mentioned, the inventor of all things about Leo Szilard, the narrator who is being Szilard will tell you all these things that Szilard was thinking at the time he then came out with the bon mot, the brilliant one-liner that he's famous for.
Mhm. So obviously, we have a huge amount of inspiration around us, especially for the type of science fiction that you write. What is next for you as an author, both of novels and obviously of all these other incredible projects that you're able to work on?
You know, we're all, as you and I speak, still dealing with COVID-19, the novel
Yeah.
coronavirus, and lockdowns and stay at homes and businesses closed and, personal interaction. This is the week that my book came out, The Oppenheimer Alternative. And in a normal week when I have a new book out, I would be doing public, personal, face to face events. I'd be touring, bookstore, one after another night, face to face interviews with interviewers.
Mhm.
It's all virtual. And so the project I'm working on now is a science fictional look at what it means to go from a long term virtual existence back to a physical existence. Of course, it
Mhm.
will be with masks and metaphors, but I hope to get through that science fictional conceit of having a little distance and never even once mentioning COVID-19, of getting to the real fundamental sociological and psychological changes that I think are permanent that will have come out of this crisis.
That's definitely true. I was on a Zoom friend hangout recently because that's how we do things now, and one of my dear friends, she said, I'm really concerned about what this will have done to how I interact with other people, and how her anxiety, it sort of handles situations, because grocery shopping, which was once fun, is now terrifying. And she's high risk, and so am I. So we were sort of commiserating about this weird fear of other people that, as a woman and a sort of female presenting person, we both have fear of various demographics, like men, on the daily. But this is like everyone. It could be anyone, and that is just such a huge impact. And both of us we're talking about how concerned we are if it'll go away, and if our interaction with other people will be permanently changed. So I think that's definitely, I'll need that roadmap going forward.
The way I look at it is this: my mother, uh, and my father for that matter, but they lived through the Great Depression, right?
Hmm.
My mother was born in 1925, lived through the Great Depression of the 1930s. She died 3 years ago, so she died in the 20 teens. But
Hmm.
she was scarred for life by the Great Depression. She could
Yeah.
never finish a meal. There always had to be leftovers because you didn't know if there'd
Right.
be any meal tomorrow. There was always a little bit left in every container of food or box of cornflakes or whatever it was, because just saving for a rainy day. We had old-fashioned word, I guess, a pantry or something in the basement,
Mhm.
which was stacked high with canned goods. There was zero chance. I mean, she was a professional economist. If another recession or depression was coming, she and my dad, who also was a professor of economics, would have seen it coming well in advance to stock up.
Mhm.
But she could not shake the impact that crisis had on her life. And
Mhm.
everybody who lived through it, it won't change necessarily in huge ways. We can argue epigenetics and so forth. It won't change in huge ways our DNA, our future offspring. But boy, it will imprint itself on every one of us for the rest of our lives. This is
Mhm.
our generation's war that we're going through here. It will have that degree of impact psychologically.
That is very true. Well, hopefully we'll be able to navigate it with some semblance of grace, I guess, if we can be afforded that. Um,
But we're showing that we haven't even navigated it with grace during it.
that's
There's so many, there's a phrase now, COVIDiot, right? Which is a great
I haven't heard that one.
neologism. COVIDiot, it's the people who are out there crowding together in parks and beaches with no masks, or going to raves or parties or nightclubs with no masks, no social distancing, who think, yeah, I've never been denied anything in my life. I'm a
Mhm.
millennial, who has had the educational system say what I think is more important than learning what the great scholars of the past has thought. Nobody can tell me. And we have people of my age group, and I'm a baby boomer,
Mhm.
tail end of the baby boom. People of my age group saying you can't trample on my rights. These
Mhm.
are, in some cases, baby boomers are all post-war, but their parents all knew during, let's say, the London Blitz, when London was being bombed into oblivion by German bombers. Nobody said, "You can't tell me I have to keep the lights off in my house," when the entire city went dark so that the
Right.
bombers couldn't find targets. It's my right to turn on the light. I'm going to read my book no matter what. Right? And we have unbelievably stupid,
Mhm.
genocidal, self-genocidal response by a lot of people. I'm not going to take this seriously, this deadly disease. I'm going to party like it's 1999 when there was no particular plague at the moment, instead of partying not at all like it's 2020 and we're facing a deadly enemy.
Yeah. It's been incredible watching how divided people are. I mean, it's like you said earlier, there are so many divisive things in our society now, partially because of our ability to see it because of technology. But I've just been floored at certain people who I'm close with, their response. It's just like I thought you were a different type of person, and it's
Yes.
like the 2016 elections. I think it is magnified, really, people's values in a novel way, and it's really changing a lot of friendships and family relationships. I think for so many people.
It really is. We should all be wearing masks, literally,
Hmm.
but metaphorically, the masks have come off, and we're seeing people
Yes,
for who they really are.
yeah, that's definitely true. So obviously, as we mentioned earlier, none of your events are live in person. But where can people find you in the next few weeks as you promote your newest book?
Well, in this virtual world we live in, I'm online, of course. This is the 25th anniversary of my website. I'm very proud of that. I was the first science
Congratulations.
fiction writer in the world to have a website about his science fiction writing, and I was the first Canadian author of any type to have a website. And so I got a great address for it. It's sfwriter.com. S is in
Just wondering how you
science.
got that.
Be the first, you can get whatever you want. The fool that I was a friend of mine said, yeah, but I'm going to get Sci-Fi. And he got Sci-Fi, Martin Harry Greenberg, and then later sold it to the Sci-Fi channel for $1 million.
Oh my gosh.
And I will sell sfwriter.com to anybody for $500,000. Not only that, I'll take Canadian dollars. It's a bargain, folks. But that's my website, sfwriter.com. And then on social media, Facebook in particular, where I'm very active, Twitter, Patreon, I'm Robert J. Sawyer. No punctuation, all compressed together.
Awesome. Well, that's fantastic, and I'm actually looking forward to reading your book. It was delivered to my inbox a few days ago,
Oh, very good.
so I'm
Yes.
looking forward to that, and I can't wait to share my thoughts on that as well. I'm sure I'm going to enjoy it. But thank you so much for joining me today and just taking time out of your very busy launch schedule to chat.
What an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure chatting with a fellow writer. And thank you. And I wish you the greatest of luck with your work too.
Thank you so much. This has been the Amphibian Press podcast. I'm V.S. Holmes, and with me today was Robert J. Sawyer. Thank you so much for listening.